I have a folder on my desk. I've had it for 6 years now. It's not thick, maybe 40 pages total, printed, 3-hole punched. The edges have gone soft from handling. Inside, 7 peer-reviewed papers arguing that near-death experiences are neurological artifacts, oxygen deprivation, REM intrusion, temporal lobe overactivation, carbon dioxide fluctuation during hypoxia. The brain doing what brains do when they're running out of time. I read those papers in the 6 months after my own surgery, not because I doubted what happened to me. I think I read them because I did. I needed someone credible to tell me there was still an exit, a place where doubt could live. Most of those papers were written by the same person, a cognitive neuroscientist. I'll call him Dr. Daniel Frey. In 2018, I found a 7th paper with his name on it. Different from the others. Completely different. He had flatlined. And when he came back, he published something I almost couldn't finish reading. I'm going to tell you about Dr. Frey today because his case is the one that took away the last thing I was using to protect myself. Dr. Frey had spent just under 20 years as a cognitive neuroscientist specializing in what academics call anomalous experiences. That's the polite term for things people report that don't fit the standard model of consciousness. He wasn't hostile about it. I want to make that clear. He wasn't one of those skeptics who enjoys the contempt. He genuinely believed, and had the data to support it, that near-death experiences were the product of a brain under catastrophic stress, generating imagery from memory, expectation, and cultural imprinting. He'd published 11 papers on the subject. 1 book. He was the researcher journalists called when they needed a counterquote to something like Pim van Lommel's Lancet study or Sam Parnia's AWARE research. He'd read it all. He knew the literature better than most people who believed it. In February of 2017, Dr. Frey was 54 years old. He went to his GP because of something that had been bothering him for 2 weeks, a persistent dull ache between his shoulder blades. Not severe, just there. His blood pressure read 178/102. His GP sent him directly to the ER. What followed moved fast. Imaging showed a type A aortic dissection, a tear in the inner wall of the aorta, the main artery out of the heart. It's one of the most dangerous events in cardiovascular medicine. Without surgical repair, the mortality rate climbs roughly 1 to 2% per hour. He was in the OR within 90 minutes of arriving. During the repair, open heart surgery using cardiopulmonary bypass, his heart went into a systole, full cardiac arrest. 9 minutes and 14 seconds according to the surgical record. They brought him back. And when he came around in the ICU the following day, he described 3 things he had seen while his heart wasn't beating. 3 specific things. He told the ICU night nurse. Not the attending, not anyone he thought would write it down. The night nurse who asked how he was feeling at around 2 in the morning. She wrote them in her personal notebook. Not the chart. Her notebook. She'd started doing that years ago with patients who said things she couldn't explain and didn't want to lose. The first thing. Dr. Frey described a timer on the anesthesiologist's laptop screen. During the procedure, the anesthesiologist had been running her own timer on a personal laptop. She did this routinely for her own records. The laptop was on a supply cart positioned behind and to the right of the surgical table. The screen was facing away from where Daniel was lying. He was on the table, unconscious, chest open. He had no way to see that screen. He said the timer read 9:23. The surgical record shows a systole began at 14:37:41. He showed first cardiac response at 14:46:55, 9 minutes and 14 seconds. The anesthesiologist confirmed she had been running her own timer. When she checked it at the moment he responded, it read 9:21. 9:21, he said 9:23. The 2-second discrepancy sits inside normal measurement lag. the second thing. He described his surgical resident stepping out of the OR and leaning against the wall in the corridor outside. He said the resident looked pale and was pressing his back against the wall with his eyes closed. He described the resident's shoes. White athletic shoes. Asics, he said, with a red sole. And he said the left shoelace was tied differently from the right. Not just tied differently, knotted in the middle, a fisherman's knot, he called it. When the resident was asked about this, he showed his shoe. The shoelace had snapped 2 days earlier. He'd knotted it in a hurry and hadn't replaced it yet. The knot was exactly where Daniel said it was. That detail had not been mentioned to anyone. It wasn't something anyone would mention. It was a broken shoelace. The third thing was different from the first two. Less verifiable in the clinical sense, but it's the one I've thought about the most. He said he went somewhere. He didn't use the word tunnel. He said that word felt wrong when he tried to apply it. He said it was more like a sense of containment giving way, like a room you'd spent your entire life in. A familiar room, a room you knew every corner of, suddenly having no ceiling, or no walls, or both. There was light. He was very careful about that word. Not light like a source, not a lamp, not a beam. Light like a quality, like the difference between a room lit by a single bulb and a room lit by a window that takes up an entire wall. Not brighter, necessarily. Just different in kind. He didn't see anyone he recognized. What he encountered, and watch how carefully a cognitive neuroscientist chose his words here, what he encountered was what he described as a quality of attention. Not a person, not a figure, not a voice. A quality of attention directed at him, as if something that knew him completely was present. Not watching him, not evaluating him. Present. The way an old friend is present in a room before they say anything. The way a parent is present in the next room when you can't sleep and you know they're there and that's enough. He said, I spent 20 years studying why people feel that, and then I felt it. And my 20 years were not adequate preparation. He described the return as the most unpleasant thing he'd experienced. Not painful, unpleasant. Like being pulled back into a coat that had been comfortable for 54 years and suddenly fit 3 sizes too small. He came around in the ICU at 2 in the morning and asked the night nurse for her notebook. He said, I want to tell you 3 things before I decide not to. She wrote them down. Here's what I need you to understand about why the verification piece matters so much in this specific case. Daniel Frey wasn't just a patient who reported something inexplicable. He was a researcher who had spent 2 decades building and maintaining the explanatory frameworks used to dismiss exactly what he'd just experienced. He knew the playbook. He'd written parts of it. So when he recovered, he did what a neuroscientist does. He applied his own frameworks to his own experience. Timer could be explained by preoperative observation of the setup. Shoelace detail. Observer bias in the nurse transcribing. He could have mentioned the shoes in a pre-surgical conversation and not remembered. Resident in the corridor, fabricated post hoc, consistent with normal OR procedure for distressed team members. He published all of this. In a paper the following year, he listed every explanation he would have used if a colleague had brought him this case, step by step. He was thorough. He was fair to himself. And then he published why each explanation broke down when applied to the actual documented conditions. The timer, the anesthesiologist confirmed the laptop position and that the screen would not have been visible from the surgical table at any point before or during the procedure. There was no preoperative access to the supply cart area. The shoelace, the resident confirmed he had told no one about the broken lace. It had not come up in any conversation. Daniel had been sedated before the resident arrived in the room. The resident stepping out, confirmed by the OR log, which noted a brief exit at 14:40, approximately 2.5 minutes into the arrest period. The resident later said he'd stepped out because he was struggling. He hadn't mentioned that to the team. He had his back against the wall, eyes closed, exactly as Daniel described. Bruce Grayson at the University of Virginia calls this category of evidence veridical perception. Perception during cardiac arrest that is later verified against objective facts. Grayson has been documenting these cases for decades, carefully, without overclaiming. In his 2021 book, After, he notes that the challenge isn't finding these cases, it's that medicine has no systematic protocol for collecting them. The night nurse's notebook is the protocol, a personal notebook. Sam Parnia's AWARE study, published in Resuscitation in 2014, was one of the first attempts at prospective, controlled verification. Visual targets placed on shelves in cardiac arrest rooms, visible only from an elevated out-of-body position. Out of over 2,000 cardiac arrests, one patient provided a verified description of events during 3 minutes of no heartbeat. Parnia's conclusion: the data doesn't fit the expected model of consciousness. Daniel Frey had co-written a critique of Parnia's methodology in 2015. He knew the sample size argument. He knew the limitations. He cited his own critique in his 2018 paper. And then he explained why he could no longer stand behind it. His editors asked him to reconsider the conclusion. He didn't. That folder on my desk, I need to tell you what I was doing with those papers, because I think some of you might be doing the same thing and not know it. In the months after my surgery, after I woke up in recovery and told the anesthesiologist what he'd said to the scrub nurse while I was coded, and he confirmed it, word for word, with a look on his face I still think about. In those months, I went looking for outs. Not because I wanted to undo what happened, but because knowing it changed everything about my 22 years in that ICU. Every patient I'd reassured with the wrong words. Every chart where I'd written anoxic hallucination and moved on. If what happened to me was real, then what I'd done to those patients was... I don't have a clean word for it. So I read Daniel Frey's papers. I read them slowly. I wanted them to work. They almost did. In my 3rd year at Providence Portland, I had a patient, a retired chemistry professor, late 60s, the kind of man who kept a pocket periodic table in his wallet as a private joke about himself. He went into ventricular fibrillation during a routine post-procedure check. We got him back in under 4 minutes. When he was stable, he told me he had been above his own body. He described the color of my scrubs, teal, that day. He described the code cart being wheeled in from the left. He said there was a student nurse by the door who looked like she was going to be sick. She was. I'd sent her out 30 seconds before he coded. He had already been sedated. I wrote in his chart, patient reports vivid perceptual experience consistent with anoxic hallucination. No clinical significance. I wrote that in less time than it took him to tell me what he'd seen. When I read Daniel Frey's debunking papers, some part of me was reading them for that chemistry professor, to confirm what I'd written, to close that case one more time. Then I read the 7th paper, and I understood that Daniel and I had spent years building the same structure for the same reason. And when his came down, it took the last load-bearing wall of mine with it. I still don't know exactly what we were in when we were there. I don't think that's the question the data is asking me to answer, but the shoelace is still the shoelace. I looked up Daniel Frey's full publication record last year. You can find it in any academic database. His debunking papers and his 2018 paper sit side by side. Same author, same institutional affiliation, same journal family in some cases, 2 bodies of work. One arguing for 20 years that the door was closed. One, 4 pages explaining why he could no longer argue that. The only thing that changed between them was that he died. For 9 minutes and 14 seconds, if you've ever needed someone credible to tell you that what you experienced was real, that you're not confused, not broken, not reaching, I want you to know that credibility doesn't always come from lifelong believers. Sometimes it comes from the person who spent the longest time not believing, and then couldn't hold it anymore. Daniel Frey still teaches cognitive neuroscience. He doesn't teach about near-death experiences. He says he's not qualified to. I think that might be the most honest thing a researcher has ever said about this. Take care of each other.